to China. He didn't know me, I didn't know him. He had Monday morning staff meeting and I was the only medical person. So he had a good cup of coffee at the residence and I was delighted to go when possible. And we married in April of 1978 after having met in the summer of '77. I had a Chinese wedding in Chaoyang district and it was just very special. It was rather magical from that point on. Deng Xiaoping was a very interesting person, it seemed to me. He had so many different aspects of behavior. When I first met him, he was always in a situation of meeting foreigners, Americans in this case. They would have been from the Senate or our Congress, or perhaps they were a group of mayors or a group of farmers that might have been visiting China. But he met only those, of course, at the highest levels because his time was so limited. The meetings were held at the Great Hall of the People. The rooms were very large. Each room was designated for a province, so it was always a bit of a mystery as to which room we would get to be in, and I was always delighted to see the differences in the artwork that represented those particular provinces. But he would always be sitting in the center of the horseshoe-shaped chair arrangement. He listened very carefully. He had excellent translators, simultaneous translators much of the time. He was very quick to have a reply. He was also very quick to have a laugh. He had a wonderful laugh. The president both had what I might call a grandfather laugh. The laughter that you'd want your grandfather to have, one of joy, when it was appropriate. When he could verbally walk around the world asking, in the sense of diplomatically speaking, talking about the issues in Europe, the issues in Africa, the specifics. He would ask questions of the various leaders that he was meeting with. Very pleasant memories of him. And traveling with him in the United States was a real pleasure. Room table at 10 o'clock that Saturday morning, which would have been 9 o'clock Friday night in Washington. We had a shortwave radio, and we listened to President Carter make the announcement to the American people that normalization with the Chinese government had been agreed to. Deng Xiaoping had agreed to, accepted an offer and agreed to that he would be the one to come to the United States, I believe on the 29th of January, which was a very auspicious day. I think it was the first day of Spring Festival. It was a very happy time, and everybody was so surprised. They just didn't think it was going to happen so quickly, and they didn't realize that the meetings had been going on. A few people that were suspicious for the wrong reasons, actually, and so it was a nice surprise Saturday morning of the 16th of December. The president held his news conference in Washington, and then the Chinese president held his news conference, which was a first. He'd never held one before publicly, and he took, I believe, some questions and answers, as I recall. And then we had on the 1st of January a very large reception at the house, at the residence, to which Deng Xiaoping came, and his wife, Julian, and then Fan Yi and his wife, and Wang Hua, and many of the officers of the government with their spouses. It was a very happy occasion. I think the relationship with China today is so very different, for legitimate reasons, but very different than could have ever been thought about in 1978. When Leonard talked about Chinese making automobiles that were quality automobiles, they sat around that dining room table and talked about what an improvement that would be for the people of China, the masses of people who live in China. The thought of exporting an automobile was beyond the thought, because there's so many people in China who needed them. My last trip was in '97 with Leonard, And then I didn't have the chance to go back until 2009, and there was almost no bicycle to be seen in Beijing. And so the difference in the culture, the difference in people's eating habits, the difference in physique, the difference in travel. We want the very best person for the job, regardless of gender, regardless of color, regardless of religion. We want the best person. Just like in China, you have a different system, but you want people who have ability and capability to be broad thinkers. That's what Deng Xiaoping had. He had vision. You could see the sparkle in his eye. He had a vision and a toughness and a feeling of, we can do this. We do not have to be what we were. We can do this. And that's what you saw when we traveled the United States with him. And he's in the simulator going to space, just like any of us would be. I mean, it is so incredible to sit in those simulators and here you're flying off into space for real, because you're in the simulator. And he got to do that. He got to feel like what those kinds of events would be. And he took those memories home. And I think he loved his grandchildren. He would talk about his grandchildren. We had a good time. We were still in Washington, and Jolynn had been to the Children's Hospital. And the picture on the Washington Post the next morning was, we used to speak about above the fold or below the fold of the front page. She was above the fold. He was below the fold. And so he looked at her and he said, and just smiled, and they laughed about it. But she was so popular. She was just so charming to be with. And we went to the zoo together and got to see the pandas. President Carter's Amy, she was quite young, and she was, Jolynn was very smitten with her, reminded of her own grandchildren. She in her own right was a fascinating lady to be around. But Deng Xiaoping had lots of laughter and so curious. I remember at the rodeo in Houston, the curiosity of seeing how people had used the rodeos as he was told the history of the settling of the West. And then of course when he wore the white hat and rode in the stagecoach, which you've all seen the movies of him riding in the stagecoach, I'm sure. And then the very best story, perhaps on a personal note for him, was the State Department, our State Department, had been told by the Chinese Foreign Affairs Office that he would prefer, Deng Xiaoping would prefer, bland food, nothing spicy. And that raised a few eyebrows from those of us who had been around him and seen him enjoy spicy food. But indeed, the word went out, and so we got to Georgia, and at this point there have been 3 official meals, and we're having the 4th official meal in Georgia with the Governor Busby and his wife, and Ji Jiaju was the translator, and he was simultaneous. It was just wonderful. Deng Xiaoping was asked if there was anything special he had noted in the United States so far. And he said yes, veal with every meal. Sure enough, he had had veal served at every single dinner of the official dinners so far. And so when we got to Houston and there was spicy barbecue at the rodeo, he was enjoying every morsel of it. It was just wonderful. So that was a good memory.